The early United States was a whirlwind of experimental government, written constitutions, and popular participation in government, for some. This was most evident in the New England town meeting. Town meetings were, and really still are, a political institution that has existed in the northeastern United States since colonial times. It became an integral part of New England society, where citizens of a town could voice concerns to their local government, or even make decisions about their town through a process that flirted with direct democracy. Even women were permitted to participate, even though they couldn't vote. To understand the meetings, it's important to look at how the towns developed. Settlers were eligible to settle land as long as 1, they were God-fearing members of the Church of England, and 2, they would make the journey in a group, usually about 24 families or more. Contrast this with Virginia or other southern colonies where they just needed bodies to throw on farms. Slaves, debtors, indentured servants, prisoners, these weren't people who were coming from intact family units. In New England, these requirements meant that the people they sent to the New World would be whole families, sometimes whole towns. Even more, these groups would share a religion, which provided even more social cohesion. Puritan communities met both of these criteria. They were a branch of the Church of England, who were very reform-minded, and lived in close-knit communities who could easily organize themselves to migrate. So the General Court granted a tract of land to the settlers as long as their group was large enough and Jesus-y enough. Ownership of the land was transferred to the family heads of the group, the men, who were referred to as the proprietors, the owners. The proprietors held meetings amongst themselves to determine how their tract of land should be divided. They prepared the town layout, reserving plots for houses, a church, and a school, all around a central commons area. The land surrounding the town layout was divided into fields, and those fields into strips. Each proprietor was randomly assigned certain strips to each field, as well as a house plot. This way of dividing land assured that no settler would get stuck with a plot that was all rocky soil, but they were permitted to swap land with other settlers to consolidate their holdings. The remaining land was held in reserve for the new families as the town grew and more settlers came to the New World. Property-owning men were all permitted to provide input into how their town was to be laid out and divided, and as the town developed, the proprietors would vote more and more on the day-to-day administration of their town and the surrounding areas. Towns across New England developed in much the same way, and they began to enjoy a healthy degree of local autonomy. When meetings were held, the inhabitants and surrounding farmers would all pile into the meeting house, or church, or tavern, really whatever building could accommodate all of them. Voting on issues during local elections was done by a show of hands, majority rules, but as time went on, more formalized elections were carried out by casting ballots. There is some over-romanticizing that goes on when talking about how democratic and egalitarian these town meetings were, which is not necessarily the case. Higher-ups in the town, like officers in the militia, ministers, or otherwise rich people, were often permitted to draw land 2 or 3 times, effectively doubling or tripling their property right off the bat. New settlers in the town had to purchase property to be able to vote in the town meetings, which often disqualified poorer artisans, farmhands, and of course, the small but not insignificant number of slaves. These groups were permitted to attend and at times debate in meetings, but like the women of the town, they were not allowed to vote. Politics in coastal towns were often dominated by wealthy merchants who had more free time to attend meetings than farmers spending most days working in their fields outside of town. Likewise, inland towns were often controlled by the innkeepers, ministers, and other citizens that lived and worked within the town. New Englanders were also still bound by the laws of Old England, as well as the laws of the colonial assembly, later the state assembly. It was all very top-down, but the institution let the far-flung settlements manage their own affairs. And more importantly, they were a useful way to gauge the support for issues facing the colony/state, to see which way the winds were blowing on whatever hot topic of the day was. For example, in 1776, Massachusetts towns were asked whether the colony should declare its independence from Great Britain. In 1778, the Assembly in Boston submitted the Articles of Confederation to the towns for approval. The colonial or state governments didn't take this feedback lightly. Massachusetts' first attempt at a state constitution was soundly rejected by the inland towns, and the state constitution had to be tweaked until it was accepted. So the town meeting wasn't a perfect democracy, not by a long shot, but what it did do was get people participating and interested in the political process. Whether it was independence, state constitutions, the Articles of Confederation, or a new federal constitution, spoilers, New Englanders wanted to be kept in the loop, and they wanted a thorough discussion.